Welcome back. We have been discussing workload optimization, and we just finished discussing disaster recovery, and now we're going to start talking about planning for data backups.
Yeah, one of the pieces of data recovery is to back up content. You know, if you can't back up content, you can't restore content, your idea of redundancy goes away and the RPE level goes higher, the resume producing event. We're trying to avoid those. So what we're going to do is help you understand what SharePoint backups are all about. We'll talk about the transaction log process and the recovery models. A lot of people get confused as to whether I should put my databases in full recovery or if I should put them in simple recovery, and sometimes you'll get bad advice on the internet, oddly enough. So we're going to look at the backup process and the models, and then we'll just kind of briefly go through the backup options that we have inside of Central Admin. Then we'll actually walk through the SQL Server database backup process, because you need to be familiar with that, because as we mentioned earlier, even if you decide that you want to be in charge of your backups, your SQL DBA needs to be doing backups as well. So we'll look at what they're doing. So if you're having a conversation with them over lunch, you're going to understand what they're talking about. And then we'll just go out to a site that's going to allow you to get more comfortable and confident with backup solutions, because you'll have all sorts of options and you'll be able to browse to that, and we'll have access to the resources that we're going to provide with the course. So that's where we're going to head, and where we're going to begin is understanding the types of backups.
So what kind of backup types do we have?
Well, we have three. We had three. Well, actually, let me say this. We have two inside of SharePoint, which is another reason we want to do SQL Server backups. Inside of SharePoint, when we'll go in there just shortly, you're going to see I can go in and do a full backup, which means it's going to take a picture of all of my databases regardless of what's changed. So if it's 20 gigs and I do a full backup every night, it's going to take a picture of all 20 gigs. And if I add another gig on Tuesday, it's going to take a picture of 22 gigs, and another 4 on Wednesday, 26 gigs. So it's cumulative, and whatever's in that database gets backed up, period. Now, differential backups are also cumulative, but in a different way. What they're going to do is they're going to take a backup, but it's only going to back up the changes since the last time I did a full. I got a little scenario at the end of this module. We're going to walk through that SQL. It's kind of more SQL related, but it's applicable to this situation here. So let's say we do a full on Sunday night. We can do differentials Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. Monday is going to contain all the changes since Sunday night. Tuesday will contain all the changes since Sunday night. And Wednesday will contain all the changes since Sunday night. So as my week goes on, my differentials get larger.
Right.
But remember what our backup strategy is all about. Recovery. We want to make sure we want to minimize the downtime. If I use a differential backup strategy, I have to do one full recovery, and then I have to do Wednesday's differential restore. Now I'm doing 2 restores versus 4 restores if I was doing incremental. Now, incremental backups aren't even available in SharePoint, but they are if you're talking to the DBA. They're going to say, yeah, I do differentials twice a week or once every day, and I do incrementals 9, noon, and 3 o'clock. So what they're doing is they're doing backups since the last incremental, so that way if we lose something at noon, we can roll back to that piece. And we're going to go through like a scenario, like I said earlier on, later on in this module here. So full backups, everything gets covered. Differential, cumulatively throughout the week since the last full, we'll get more and more changes. That backup will get larger, but it's a single restore. Incrementals, every hour I take an incremental, or every 3 hours. Those have to be restored sequentially in order to do a recovery process, which slows down the recovery process, hence the reason we tend to lean towards a full/differential backup recovery process and backup and recovery process.
So what does a SharePoint farm backup look like?
SharePoint farm backups look something like this, and we've got to be careful because a lot of people are under the impression that, so we've got our content and our application databases over here, and that's supposed to be a circle, not an upside down heart, but these blue databases right here are going to be backed up all the way down to this backup file. And a lot of people think it's a single file back there. It's multiple files that it gets backed up to. So when I'm backing up content, it's actually backed up to a location that we've specified. We can pre-configure that inside of Central Admin. We're going to bebop around inside of Central Admin in just a few minutes around the backup strategy. But if I'm backing up just a configuration database, remember starting with SharePoint 2013, I believe, we can actually back up and restore configuration information. So if I want to build out this perfect farm here, and then I want to move it to, farm 2, before I had to rebuild the whole farm and then use that configuration database. Well, that didn't work out so well. So when we back up our configuration database information, this guy here, we're actually going to do a file system backup, and it's going to back up, I believe it's to XML files, which are stored then into the backup file server. So now if I want to recover just my configuration information, let's say my configuration database gets toasted, and I need to replace it, and all my content databases are fine, I can actually do a restore now using configuration information. So, but one of the challenges that people run into is the idea of a transaction log. They're like, dude, I hear database, database. What's this transaction log thing? Well, the good news is every large database product, including Oracle, has a transaction type database or a file associated with it. And what it does, it stores all my inserts, my updates, and my deletes. If I'm reading stuff, it doesn't have anything to do with the transaction log, but it inserts, updates, and deletes get stored in this transaction log. And what happens if I'm going in SharePoint and I go gather a list of items and I want to change that list of items because I'm in quick edit mode, it's going to load that list of items to what's called buffer cache. If it's not already there, it's going to check to see if it's there. If it's not there, it's going to load it in. And then when I make the change, it's going to write that. Periodically, it's going to write that. It's going to take that buffer cache information. It's going to store it in what's called the LDF. That's your transaction log file. And then roughly 60 seconds, we'll just use that as an idea. There's a process built into the SQL Server world called checkpoint. And it's going to look at the LDF file and say, what's new since the last 60 seconds, the last time I was here? Right. And it's going to write those transactions that came in between the LDF and the MDF file. So that's just a general idea. And the reason I shared that with you is because if I go into the next slide, we have 3 options that we have that we can set on our databases. 2 primarily we're going to use with SharePoint. Simple and full, and bulk logged is a third one you can use in the SQL Server world. Probably not use it too much in the SharePoint space. But what happens is in simple recovery model, every time I write, remember I said the checkpoint process is every 60 seconds? Every time that gets written from the LDF to the MDF file, those transactions after they're written are purged out. All right, that's a big deal. A full recovery model leaves them in. So let me go back to the slide before. You're going to see in here, when every 60 seconds in simple recovery model, these transactions from here are written down to here, and then they're toasted. But in a full recovery model, this transaction log, actually that toast is incorrect. The toast is actually up here. My bad. They're toasted out of LDF, it's not the MDF. But the LDF file in a full recovery model, those transactions are retained. Now, you may have seen the situation, I'm sure you probably have somewhere along the way, where your LDF file is 4 gigs and your MDF file is, 400 megabytes. It's because occasionally we need to purge out that LDF file. We're going to address that as we go through this module and the next module. We'll figure out how we can kind of address that a little bit. But so the challenge is, and you'll read online, because what that scenario I just said, my LDF is ginormous, and how do I fix it? People will say to put it in simple recovery model. Do not do that in production mode, because yes, it will prevent ginormous transaction logs, but you also have just prevented the use of data recovery, because the LDF file gets purged out roughly every 60 seconds, every time it runs that checkpoint process. Yeah. So don't read everything on the internet. Don't believe everything you read on the internet. I think I've said that a couple times. So if we go back to here, simple recovery model, things like your TempDB, where it's just temporary storage, where you're not ever, if you're in a dev environment, you're working in a dev environment, you don't need to worry about backing up your transaction log. You don't need to worry about backing up because it's just going to be content information that you can pull out of your production farm. You don't really need to be backing that up. Right. Put everything in simple recovery over there. I'm okay with that. But in production, you're going to want it in full recovery model. Full recovery model says keep those transactions in the transaction log, the LDF file. So in the event we have to do a recovery, which we're going to walk through a scenario between this module and the next module, we'll have all the transactions since the last time we did a transaction log backup or we did a full backup. And again, we'll work together on that. Bulk log, just a quick second on that one, is I'm going to just import 1 million records, and I don't want every transaction to be logged. It's going to slow it down. So I'm going to put it in bulk log, say, bam, in the transaction log, say, 1 million record insert begins, and when the 1 million records complete, 1 million records ended. And that's all you have in here, saying a bulk log occurred between that time frame. But not every transaction is written. Would you recommend that for migration purposes for bulk log? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, if you're trying to migrate content and you want to actually bring content into the databases over there, you could actually use bulk log for that. So you've acquired an organization and you're having to bring them onto your farm. That would be the best time to do that. Absolutely. Great point. Very good. All right, so SharePoint backups. We're not going to do one. We're going to actually just explore the options associated with SharePoint backups. Let me jump out to our image. It's also important that you focus on a good schedule for backups as well, so that, like you were mentioning, what does the DB
do? How often does he do that? Is this documented? Is this written down? Is this what's the procedure behind that? If there's a change request, are you bringing in more content? So like having that open line of communication and a schedule for your backup practices is really healthy.
Yeah, again, that communication with your DBA. We've gone into Central Admin. We're going to go to the category on the left called Backup and Restore. And within the Backup and Restore, we're going to look at some options that are available. We're not going to go through each and every one of them because this isn't about Central Admin. This is about understanding how the backup process works so you can create high availability and perform disaster recovery. When you see here's two different categories. We're going to focus up on the top category called Farm Backup and Restore, and then you have Granular Backups.
Very, very straightforward.
Very straightforward. And then, but this is a little bit of a pet peeve of mine, and I'm going to go ahead and click on the option to perform a backup. And when we come in here, it's going to give you every component of the farm that we have. I can back up the entire farm. I can back up a database for a specific web app. I can back up a service app. I can back up a web app. I have an option here, and I'm going to show you what I mean here. Now, normally when I'm in a Microsoft product and I see a checkbox, what does that mean?
I can select it.
I can select multiple items. Normally was the key word in that sentence. I can select farm here, all right? Mm-hmm. And that's going to back up everything. Service apps, web apps, everything, all the content databases. Mm-hmm. Or I can go down, let me grab a web app. I'll go down to our MTP portal. Let's say I want to back that up, and I want to back up my managed metadata service. Can't do that. You get one choice. You get one pick. If you go to MTP portal, for instance, and you expand on that, and I want to back up my Content 1 database, and then I want to back up my sites. No, you get one click. So unlike the radio buttons where you get one selection, for some reason this interface uses checkboxes and it's been that way for several versions. It's a little confusing to me, but they haven't asked me, so it's okay. But this is where we can go in and choose a component. What am I missing here, though? I'm missing the idea. How many people get paid by the hour? Usually in the IT pro space, you're not. Your salary. And one thing I can't do in here is I can't schedule this from in here. So what you're going to want to do is take advantage of PowerShell. PowerShell allows you to create these same backups, whether you want to back up every web app, every service app, the entire farm, specific contents within a web app, PowerShell it. Make a script out of it, PowerShell it. Schedule it so it's running off hours so that way those backups are being performed. That's the biggest thing between running a backup from inside of Central Admin and PowerShell. Can't schedule within here like you can with PowerShell. Let me go back out while we're in here and just look at a couple other items. Configure backup settings. This is one that you'll want to address because inside of here we can decide where our backup location is going to be. We don't want to have to specify it every time. And again, we want to think about where that's going to be. And we want it in a location where we can access the content. And that's always a conversation that we have with any company when I'm looking at their backup strategy is where do I put it? Notice the default. The default is on the C drive. Is it smart to have your backups on the C drive of your server where your SQL Server instance is running?
No.
The answer is no. Good answer.
Very bad.
Yeah, it's horrible. So what we want to do is change that to another drive, either on the server or maybe go to a network share. And we've been talking about regional incidents. So we talked about the idea we have hurricanes on the East Coast, we have Tornado Valley in the middle, we have mudslides in California. Anything could happen. So locations, really you should have two copies in addition to your production. You should have one quickly accessible for recovery, which is what we'll talk about in the next module, and we should have one remote. And how far remote means is up to you. If I'm in the middle of Tornado Valley, then the next building's probably not good enough, and the next county might be safer. If I'm along the East Coast where there's hurricane, I may want to put one, maybe this is where I jump into Azure, back up into Azure and put it in Japan if I want to.
Was just about to say that because that's the best part about doing things in a cloud-based service like Azure is that you can prepare an environment for highly effective disaster recovery.
Yeah, you get to choose where you want to place those backups. And so that's why I'm recommending that the location, two copies, one local for quick recovery, and then based on your region, where you are in the world, you decide where you want that remote copy. And that remote copy could be in another country if that works out the best for you. And something else we can do is there's a value here for backup threads and restore threads. So for now, for backup threads, which would be applicable to restore, it uses 3 threads to perform a backup. So let's say we have a 60 gigabyte database we're going to do a full backup on in SharePoint. If it's using, and it takes 6 hours, just to keep the math easy for me. 60 gigs, 6 hours, 1 thread. If we use 3 threads, 60 gigs, now it's going to be writing 3 times as fast, should hypothetically go down to 2 hours because we're going to be using 3 threads times 2 is the 6 hours. Hopefully I didn't confuse you. I'll stop with the math. 60 gigs, 1 thread, 6 hours, 60 gigs, 3 threads, 2 hours. That's why you'll want to take advantage of updating this. If you're running your backups at night, by the way, this is a parameter with PowerShell. If you're running your backups at night, bump this up to 6, which is taking you 60 gigs, 6 hours, 60 gigs, 6 threads, excuse me, that's 1 hour now, because hypothetically you come down to 1 hour to perform this 60 gig backup. And that's, again, just those hypothetical numbers. So you can change these on the fly during the backups and restores through Central Admin or through PowerShell when you're performing these backups. But one of the things I suggest in here, you pick a location for your local location and where you want to back that up to other than the C drive, if you would, please. So we're going to go ahead and cancel that just to let you know what that was all about. And one last piece I want to look at in here while we're looking at the backup options that we have available for SharePoint content. I mentioned earlier that you could perform or recover data from unattached content database. We talked about having to go back a year to restore content or a document or a list or a library. This is where you would use that idea right here. Recover data from an unattached content database. So it's something that you backed up previously and we need to recover it this year. It doesn't have to be part of the SharePoint farm. You can back it up to a SQL Server instance. Just let me know where that SQL Server instance is, the name of that instance, and then I can drill down to the list and item level and choose that document or that list and library and recover that. So you'll want to make sure you understand that you can use that backup option. You can access previous backups using this recovery option.
And that's really important if you're trying to plan, let's say you're bringing on organizations and whatnot, and then let's say you sell that particular organization, that part of that business, right? Well, you also have to make sure that you can document at what point in time, let's say for government agencies that are doing auditing of that particular sale, perhaps, because it's a really massive, impactful situation. So being able to go out and grab things will also alleviate any potential tensions from different departments that are using your SharePoint space. Because if you're trying to just keep up the health, you don't necessarily need to have 10 years of content still available. Right. Well, maybe your plan is that you have 3 years of the most active content just to keep the health, let's say, of your SharePoint. Well, let's say somebody in finance needs a special document that was prepared 10 years ago because they're going through an audit. Well, they can recover that, and you're able to get that information back to someone.
Yeah, exactly. So planning considerations. We're talking about planning as we go throughout this course, and we've got several options available to us here. First off, plan for common events, failures, errors, and accidental deletions. I think you even talked about this earlier. Someone accidentally deletes a document, or the CFO.
The whole library.
Yeah, or the whole entire library list. We got to not only plan for hardware and software failures, but also plan for accidental deletions. And I mentioned earlier, disaster recovery could be a document for an end user, and it could be an entire farm for an IT pro. Plan for local emergencies and regional emergencies. We just talked about that second backup being off-site and remote, however you want to word that. And that remote could be in a different country if you need to be. But make sure that you have that remote copy for regional emergencies. Decide what you need to back up, because in addition to what we have in SharePoint and what we have in the content databases, there's a lot of changes that we make on the SharePoint servers. The web config file, IIS settings, SQL Server reporting databases, any DNS settings that you've configured, any customizations, all of those need to be backed up in addition to what we do from inside of SharePoint and what SQL Server DBAs do for you.
Right. And on the IIS settings, I was working on a project once where somebody had manipulated the settings, and then that person was no longer with the organization, and they were trying to upgrade from 2010 to 2013 and couldn't because they had configured it in such a way that it was not compatible. So if they had that opportunity to roll back to something where they could, use the proper settings, then they would have been able to upgrade okay.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, if there's just a lot of separate components outside of the databases and the farm configuration that we want to build back up, including some additional ones here, pages, custom pages or web parts, third-party solutions. You may be using some third-party solutions, XML file changes, site destination files, workflow information. You might be creating some workflows that you've been using since 2013 with SharePoint Designer. You'll want to make sure those are all backed up and know where they're, and choose a destination. A lot of people are like, I'm going to back up my customizations in, on file server 1 and folder 1, and I'm going to back up my workflows in something else. I'm going to back up my XML file. Have a central location so when you need to perform a recovery, we're going to talk about the next module, you know exactly where to go for the backup files for SharePoint and all the customizations. Have a document in there, back to document, that all the IIS configuration settings, all the DNS settings that you've made, have all of that documented so if you need to recover, you can recover very quickly.
Especially now with Flow and Power Apps coming into the picture for SharePoint 2016, it's really important that you have that documentation occurring because workflows are changing. Apps versus web parts and web apps everything's just evolving. So just make sure you're documenting.
And speaking of documentation, if you are on-prem, you have a single server farm and maybe just a couple servers in the farm, don't store your documentation inside of SharePoint. Because if SharePoint crashes and you're trying to figure out how to recover, it's not going to do you any good at all. But if you have a hybrid solution, store your documentation that allows you to recover that you need for on-prem in your SharePoint Online up in the Office 365, and then it's okay to store in SharePoint. But I actually have seen people store their recovery documentation inside of SharePoint, thinking it was like, hey, we're collaborating on it, we're updating it, something we want to be able to utilize SharePoint for until SharePoint's not available. So be careful about where you start.
So cloud okay or a network drive if it's on-prem.
Exactly. Minimize the latency between your SQL Server and your backup location. Remember I said we could have a local copy of a backup, and that makes sense for recovery. We want that to be as quick and accessible as possible for the recovery process. What's our backup solution based on? Minimizing the recovery solution, minimizing the downtime, maximizing the use, or making sure we're meeting our commitment for the SLA. So we want to make sure that we we create this backup environment or location that we're going to store our backups as close to the SQL Server without being on the SQL Server as possible for that first copy, and then off hours, copy that local copy to wherever you decide to place that remote copy. Now, you can do what are called online backups, which means in the old days, we had to kick users out of SQL Server to do a backup. I mean, like I said, I've been working with SQL Server since 4.2a. We don't have to do that anymore. We haven't had to do that for a long time. But if we do have a couple servers out there and we are performing a backup, SQL servers out there, we are performing a backup, there might be some performance degradation. So you don't, even though you can do performance or online backups, doesn't mean you should. So run those off hours so that way you're not, the user's like, man, every day at 2 o'clock it seems to get really slow.
Yeah.
What are we doing wrong, or what am I doing wrong?
That's also the time that the help desk would get a high influx of calls because things are timing out and because they can't get to their content, or it's the internet's slow. We hear that a lot.
Yeah, exactly.
So yeah, definitely choose off-hour times that will be helpful. Now, for those who are in a global organization, there's not necessarily off hours.
Yeah, exactly.
So think about the regions that have the highest quantity of users in order to make that decision time when it comes to when you're going to run it.
And I worked for a company out of Colorado Springs, and in Colorado Springs in the summertime, about noon the clouds will build up over Pikes Peak. By 2 o'clock, we almost every day will have a thunderstorm, lightning, the whole works. Literally, they would actually perform a backup at 1:30, starting at 1 o'clock if it took until 2. So if the storm came through, there were a couple times they actually just shut the system down. The system's not going to be available between 2 and 4. It was like clockwork. When you see the clouds come up over about noon, by 2 we're getting hail and rain and thunder and lightning. So it's up until they started getting more proficient with the backups, they would just say, yep, database is not going to be available from 2 to 4. So we don't want to have to do that. We shouldn't have to do that. We just have to make sure that we plan and minimize the downtime or minimize even the degradation of the performance while we're performing these backups, keep a local copy and get a remote copy, wherever that may be. And then RAID 10, often people say, should I use RAID 5, should I use RAID 10, or is RAID 1.0? I call it RAID 10 because I like to use shorthand. But for better backup performance, it's actually better to use RAID 10 than 5 because of the parity. You don't have to worry about the parity information as much. So just some ideas on when you're planning for backups, what you should take into consideration during that planning process. Now, I put a little scenario together that we're going to start in this module and we're going to finish in the next module. So we're going to use a SQL Server database backup process, and we're going to do a full backup on Sunday. So we're just going to set up the backup theory because remember, the recovery process is our most important goal. And then on Monday, we're going to do differentials as we are on Tuesday. So remember, Sunday is going to be a full backup and everything. Monday is going to be the changes. Differential Monday is going to be the changes from Monday. Tuesday will be Monday's and Tuesday's changes, and Wednesday will be the changes from Monday, then Tuesday, then Wednesday. And by the way, if you've changed the same item between Monday and Wednesday, it's only going to keep the most recent. So let's say I went into an item in a SharePoint list, and I changed a document inside of there that said, you know, this is a great day. And then I changed it on Tuesday to this is an okay day. And I changed it on Wednesday, this is a fantastic day. We're only going to see in that recovery, we're going to see this is a fantastic day. We're not going to see the other two flavors of that document, if you will. So the setup now is full backup on Sunday. Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, we're doing a differential, which means all of our changes since Sunday are in Wednesday's backup. Thursday comes along, 4 o'clock. We lose the MDF file, the data file associated with this database. Now we have to perform a recovery. Now remember I mentioned, if we use simple recovery model, my LDF file, there's nothing in it. I've lost everything that I could use here. The best I can do is recover from Wednesday night. But if we're in full recovery model, we still have data in the LDF file. All the data, all the transactions that took place Thursday. When we go through the recovery process in the next module, we'll finish this scenario out and see how we can recover this, and you'll have a better understanding of why you don't want to be backing up or setting your databases in the simple recovery model. So this is just a setup for that. Now we're going to jump out to another site. Again, it'll be part of the resources available for this course, and we're going to take a look at some of the backup solutions that we have available to us. So here's the site that has the backup solutions in SharePoint Server 2016. I'm going to scroll down a little bit. I'm not going to bore you by going through each and every one of these. But as you can see on the left-hand side, this is broken out into different areas. I want to back up the entire farm, maybe a specific web app, maybe just the user profile service. The user profile service, the search service, and the secure store service all have caveats with them. It's not a simple backup and restore. So look at those specifically when you're working on putting a backup strategy together. I want to back up a database using to the snapshot. So I want to back up customizations, site collections, apps that we've brought in from the store. Take a look at this document here that walks you through the different considerations as you're creating your backup strategy for SharePoint Server 2016. And look at what you're trying to do. If you back up your farm every Sunday, or you decide every Wednesday you're backing up your web app separately, every Thursday or Friday you're backing up your service app separately. We've got some caveats with that you can look at. So take a look at this document or this site here, and make sure you understand the caveats which each of these backups as you create your backup strategy, because this will allow you to get more. Make sure everything's back up appropriately, and bottom line is you're trying to avoid the RP, the resume producing event. When it comes to recovery, you want to make sure everything's been backed up. You don't want to say, oh man, I forgot to back up the secure store and the passphrase for the secure store. So all of that content and all the security information about secure store is now toast. So we want to make sure we look at each one of these as an individual or individually, so you've got information about what you need to take into consideration as you're planning your backup strategy.
And really work closely with your DBA as well to incorporate their needs within the strategy as well. And it goes back to that idea of documenting it. If you have this master document, a governance document, your CIO, the senior leadership, and your users even though they may not read it, would feel a lot more comfortable that you actually have a plan and a model that will keep some consistency going on, that they'll know at, let's say, at 5 o'clock on a Friday, yeah, they're truly done for the day because they're doing a full backup or something like that.
Well, it's happy hour too.
Well, that's true.
Yeah, so. So what we have to look at here is the different types of backups, the SharePoint backups that we have available to us. We talked about the different recovery models in the transaction log process. We have to understand the recovery model in production. The answer is not simple. We want to make sure that we're using full recovery models, and we're going to expand on that in the next module. We looked at the SharePoint backup, a few SharePoint backup configuration options, and then we talked about the SQL Server database backup process and what we need to take into consideration. And remember, central admin, you can't schedule. Unless you get paid by the hour, it's not worth for you to get up at 3 o'clock in the morning and perform a backup. Use PowerShell, create scripts, schedule those scripts. And then we looked at a site where you can explore the different backup solution options that you have available to you. And there's some unique options available per service application. So make sure you spend some time with those, reviewing those before you build out your backup solution.
And so when we come back in our next module, we will be working on planning data recovery. So
see you in the next module.
Yeah.